The Legends of Payne Road by Anonymous. I hope someone can give me some insight or be entertained at the very least. I'm scared even typing this up because of what I've been reading tonight and what I remember from that night in question. Some parts of North Carolina have a road called Payne Road or Edwards Road. It's a very rural area that is said to be haunted. Well, my ex-girlfriend Angel and my best friend at the time Robert went to check it out. We wanted to see what was up because Robert's friend said that they stopped their car on the bridge and it wouldn't turn on no matter how hard they tried. It's said to be haunted because Edward Payne killed all of his slaves, hung them from that bridge, and then proceeded to kill his family, all just to appease the devil. Well, it was about midnight on a summer night, about 84 degrees, when we decided to leave for Rural Hall. When we finally get there, we approach the sign for Edwards Road. I turn down the road and continue going for quite some time. It's pretty dangerous. There are no street lights on the road, and at one part of the road it drops off entirely into a steep hill without warning. We get to the bridge, surrounded by fields that are just mud at this point, and we park right on it. Turn the car off, sit still for just a minute, and, well, nothing. I turn it back on and we keep going. This is BS, I said to my friends, but I still felt a tinge of fear for some reason. We keep going and stop at another section. My ex asks if she could drive. I say sure, why not? We drive back to said section and try it again. She does it, and the car won't start all of a sudden. I am 90% sure she's just freaking messing with me, but I'm starting to get a little scared, so I throw it neutral and push it off. It starts up, and we go. We return to the same bridge on another lap, and I get anxious. We stop about 100 feet away, and I look into the woods past the field. I notice there are green, blue, and red lights flickering all over, and then I notice disembodied shouting. It honestly sounded strange. I don't even know how to explain it. Almost like people that were rabid like dogs almost. My paranoia level increased tenfold. It didn't help that there were old abandoned barns made out of logs every 1,000 feet down the road. I'm freaking out because I've had paranormal things happen when I was a kid, and my eyes are now watering because I'm getting PTSD flashbacks. Something needs to be corrected. I try to tell my friends, but they don't really listen. That's when I see the fog that creeps out of the woods. Not where the lights are coming from, but from about 2,000 feet down the road. This thick layer of fog began to descend on us. We get back in the car and drive around again. Again, I'm on edge, heart pounding, shaking. I know something's up. We drive the length of the road and again wind up at the bridge. This time we're about 20 feet away from this concrete bridge before going over the creek. And then here comes the fog. It comes creeping out of the woods around the other side of the bridge and forms a wall that cannot be seen through. This makes me freak out more. This is the part that truly starts to freak me out the most. A circle forms in the middle of the bridge. An absolute perfect circle about 3 feet wide. My ex starts to walk towards it. She walks towards it and I'm shaking. It's almost like she's in some sort of trance. I know it's real now. I can't seem to speak, I can't seem to move, I was just so afraid. My friend Robert starts walking towards it, going after her, and I start following them, trying to get them both to stop. But I literally cannot seem to speak and my heart is pounding hard in my chest. In my head, I'm screaming, please stop, but nothing was to come out. Robert finally says, maybe this isn't such a good idea. All I can do is nod, mouth wide open, and we all get back in the car. My ex was still driving, and we returned the way we came. We are driving along, and I begin to feel a lot better after we leave the place and put some distance between us. My ex grabs her phone, and it starts screaming, ringing, and making really weird demonic noises. She may be doing this, messing with us and all that stuff, but there was just something about the fear in her eyes that told me that she was not the culprit here. We drop her off, and at this point, I'm still on edge. I'm a bit better though, but jumpy. My friend Robert and I are at the driveway of his house just talking about everything before we call it a night. We did remember hearing what sounded like a thud toward the back of my car when we were driving away from the bridge. so we go back to see if there's any marks. We don't see any scratches, and we didn't see anything else out of the ordinary. But I'll never forget this night. It's a hard story to explain, but I hope that you all enjoyed it. A Strange Encounter on a Lonely Road by The Curious Sage. A few years ago, I had a strange and unsettling experience that I still can't fully explain. It was late at night, and I was driving home from a friend's house in a rural area. The road was completely deserted, with no other cars or houses. The only light came from my headlights cutting through the darkness. As I rounded a bend, I saw a figure standing on the side of the road. It was a young girl, maybe around 10 years old, wearing a white dress that looked strangely out of place. She had long dark hair that covered most of her face. I slowed down, concerned that she might be lost or in some sort of trouble. I rolled down my window and called out to her, asking if she needed help. She didn't respond, but slowly lifted her head, revealing pitch black eyes that seemed to absorb all the light around them. A chill ran down my spine, and every instinct told me to escape there as quickly as I possibly could. I sped off, heart pounding in my chest, and never looked back. When I reached home, I told my family about the encounter, but they all dismissed it as a trick of the light or my imagination running wild. However, a few weeks later I heard similar stories from other locals about seeing a girl with black eyes on that same stretch of road. To this day, I avoid that road at all costs at night, and I can't shake the feeling that whatever I saw that night wasn't just a figment of my imagination. Has anybody else listening to this show experienced something like this? The memory still haunts me, and I can't help but wonder who or what that girl was. The Shack in Kensington by Anonymous. This story takes place about 5 years ago. I was 18 at the time, just got my license, and wanted to explore. My friends and I would spend weekends exploring the area's abandoned or supposedly haunted buildings. We were thrill seekers, and doing this in a rural location was exciting. Being in the middle of nowhere was thrilling to us. I told my uncle about some of the adventures my friends and I would go on, and he told me that when he was my age, he did similar things with his friends. He described a small shack on Kensington Road in Michigan, about 40 minutes from my house. He stated when he was younger, he and his friend heard all kinds of rumors about a cult that would inhabit the grounds and do rituals with blood and goat carcasses. This sounds like a fake cult story, but it did pique our interest. One night, they drove to Kensington in hopes of something exciting happening. And they got just that. As they arrived, a man came out to the street with a shotgun and scared them away. As they sped down the dirt road, a deer ran in front of them a little ways down the street, and they flipped their car into a ditch, trying to avoid it. Police came and investigated. The man with the shotgun was just a squatter. A few months passed and my uncle noticed something on Crime Stoppers. The man who came out to the edge of the road, who was apparently murdered, and his killer was not known at the moment. The incident made my uncle and his friends not want to go anywhere near that place again. Well, this story interested me. The following weekend I told my friends about this story and we decided we wanted to see this shack for ourselves, and it wasn't even that far away. I typed in Kensington Road on my Apple Maps app and a few other vital things my uncle said that were close to it. I found the location, and my friends and I set out for an adventure on a Saturday night. The directions took a lot of work to follow. The closer we got to the destination, the fewer cars we saw until there was no other traffic at all. There were just deserted cornfields on both sides of us as far as the eye could see. The paved road we were driving on approached a T intersection with a paved road going to the left and a dirt road going to the right. This was as far as the GPS would take us. Kensington Road was just ahead, not left or right, but straight ahead. The road was dirt, not even shown as a road on any of the maps. We drove on this dirt road for about 3 minutes before we located the shack. It was a small building, nothing impressive, tiny, slightly larger than a shed. There was no mailbox for this place and no address on the house. The windows were boarded up with wood, and they looked almost uninhabited. We didn't know what we would find, as my uncle had visited the place probably 10 years prior, and it had been a long time since then. The place still gave us the creeps. Perhaps it was because of the boarded up windows and the absolute lack of life in its surroundings. We pulled over to the side of the road in front of the shack, all afraid to get out and explore. We rolled the windows down and turned the car off to see if we could hear anything. And I swear to you, we heard chanting, like a repetition of words being said. However, we were having trouble discerning what was actually being said or if it was even in English. This gave us absolute chills, but we continued to see what else we could hear. Beneath the chanting, an extremely old broadcast was being played. It sounded something straight out of a World War II era radio program. The location and sounds were enough to give us goosebumps, and we left with chills. Now, it doesn't end there. We returned about a week later to hear the same old broadcast playing and nothing else happening. It was such a mysterious location. A few weeks had passed and we decided we want to check it out again to see if the thing was still playing. We headed there, feeling more confident now that we weren't surrounded by darkness. We parked the car on the side of the dirt road again, got out, and approached the shack. A friend of mine went around back while I held my ear to the window trying to see if I could hear anyone inside. As we were investigating, a car drove by. This was strange, mind you. This shack was in the middle of nowhere on a dirt road, very far away from any other houses. We brushed it off and continued investigating. Not even a minute later, my friend came around and told me what the heck, and we needed to get out of there quickly. He said that same exact vehicle that drove by from the opposite direction was now coming back. We started to grow more cautious, and again the car circled back around and drove right past us, never really looking at us, but just kept going around. This was enough to finally get us to snap into our right minds. We ran back to the car and drove out of there. We turned to the next available street, and to our surprise, the exact vehicle was now following behind us very closely. We were terrified. We made random turns everywhere we could to try to lose them, but we just couldn't seem to shake them. They followed behind us for at least an hour, but it was probably only 10 minutes because everything felt like it slowed down in that moment. Eventually they backed off. It'd definitely be quite some time before we ever decided to talk about the shack in Kensington, let alone ever return there. And if we do ever return there, I'll tell you this, I'm bringing an actual weapon, more than just a stick or a sword, I'll tell you that. I drive trucks for a living here in England. It was one of the only jobs I could pretty much just walk into after being medically discharged from the army. The Royal Logistics Corps to be specific, with some intense back problems. I had tried physiotherapy, yoga, acupuncture, all sorts of things, but sitting in the cab of a military truck for so long had really done a number on my spine. It was horrible that I was basically forced into the same line of work, only in the civilian world, and I had no choice but to take a daily regime of strong pain medication just to make it through the days and nights of long-distance truck driving. But that is neither here nor there, I suppose. I had only been working for the company I am with now for about 6 or 7 months, when I was driving down this lonely stretch of road just outside of Rotherham, in South Yorkshire. There, I see this young woman at the side of the road, bags in hand with her thumb out like she was looking to hitchhike. It is not like I do not see a good few hitchhikers on my routes. They are much more common than you might expect, especially during the summer months when people can afford to be standing at the side of the road, sometimes for hours at a time, waiting for lifts. I never normally stop for people. I have seen enough horror movies to know that you are inviting trouble on yourself if you just let a total stranger into your truck for long distances. But there was something about this girl that had me slowing down and stopping at the roadside for her. I do not know if it was how young she was or how desperate she looked. She did not look like the kind of scruffy, hippie type, or dodgy cardboard sign holder that I normally see standing out there. So there I was, opening my cab door and helping her climb inside. I asked her where she was looking to go, only to have her reply something like, "Anywhere, just drive." This bothered me a little bit. I will be honest, as I did not really like the idea of having someone just sat in my passenger seat for the unforeseeable future. I'm not exactly the most sociable person, and awkward silences are annoying for me at the most, let alone when it's with some girl that is half my age. God knows what people would think if they saw me, probably that I was some sort of perv or something. So I ask her again, only rephrasing the question so that I make it clear that I cannot just have her sitting in my truck for the foreseeable future, as I would be looking for somewhere to stay overnight at some point. I know it sounds a bit mean, but I did not want to have to properly look after this girl, paying for her food, paying for a hotel room, and all that. I had never picked up a hitchhiker before, but they are usually set on certain places that you can just drop them off at, right? So after a bit of awkward silence, and I made it clear that I loathe those, I asked her why she was on the road. She did not give me, honestly, much of anything in the way of specifics, just that she was having trouble at home and needed to get away. I asked her if it was a fight with her parents or a boyfriend or something, and that maybe she should just not run away from her problems, but go back and fix whatever it was, like address the issue or whatever instead of just straight up avoiding it. But she immediately took issue with the fact that I had asked her about a potential boyfriend, saying she is getting out immediately, and if I had any funny ideas about where this was going, that made the whole thing feel even more awkward, and I reassured her that I did in fact have a long-term girlfriend at home, and that I certainly was not in the habit of picking up young girls from the side of the road. I am basically explaining that I'm not a perv when I see a police car pass us on the road. Nothing unusual, so it barely registers other than for me to make sure I am not over the speed limit or anything. The usual, I just saw a police car, anxieties. But a moment later, I hear sirens behind me, looking into the rear view to see what appeared to be the very same car, having turned around to follow me, with a view to pull me over. I groan, saying something about hoping my brake lights are not out, something along those lines, and slowly beginning to pull my truck over to the side of the road. This is right when the girl in the passenger seat freaks out and starts pleading with me to not pull over. I mean, not just pleading, but she is begging, obviously getting really panicked at the idea of the police officer. Now, this made me feel bloody nervous. What had she done that made her nervous around the police? And how would that reflect on me if I were caught with her? These questions are whirling around my head, and I just tell her to calm down, that I had absolutely no other choice but to pull over. I was explaining further that I was hardly about to get into a high-speed police pursuit on account of a stranger. She burst into tears at that point, just sinking her head into her hands and weeping, but she does not try to run away. Nothing like that. So that sort of reassured me that she had not committed some sort of violent crime, or at least that she was not some hardened criminal on the run from the law. I watched the policeman that had pulled me over get out of his car and walk up to the side of my truck, which also happens to be the side that the girl sat on. As soon as he looks through the window, I hear him say something like, "Get out of the truck, Natalie." This obviously has me taken aback. Who the hell was that girl that the police officer were on bloody first name terms with her? She is crying and sobbing, but looks up at the window and screams no through the glass. The policeman mentions for me to unwind down my window, and I hesitate for a moment. The girl, this Natalie, is obviously terrified of being arrested or whatever is about to happen. The policeman then says something over his radio, something I did not catch because the glass is in the way. So to better hear what he's saying, I start winding down the window. It was too late to hear what he said on the radio, but I do hear what he said next. "Your parents called again, Natalie. They're tired of you running away like this, and quite frankly, I'm tired of having to come fetch you every time this happens." I suppose I knew all I needed to know from that, but that's when I heard something weird. I looked on in a kind of grim fascination at what was unfolding. She was saying that they're not my parents. Why won't any of you understand that? The girl started to scream. "Every time you drag me back there, they do worse and worse things to me and call it punishment. They say it's for my own good, but it's not. It's not at all." She turns to me, pulling her sleeve to show me all kinds of burns and scars up her arm. Ones that were so pronounced and gross that I recoiled in disgust and horror. "Please, I am begging you, do not let them take me back. I'll do anything. Please just don't let them take me again." What was I supposed to do? Drive off with this girl and get chased by the police? She could have been mentally ill or something, severely delusional with a self-harm problem, and I'm just going to drive off with her in the middle of nowhere so she can run away from her home or something? Besides, I was terrified. Absolutely terrified. Police backup arrived, and when there was enough of them, they dragged the girl out of my truck kicking and screaming before they threw her in the back of a police car and drove away. I tried my best to get some of the police to explain to me what the hell had just happened, and I expected to get some sort of answer along the lines of my previous suspicions, but they just waved me away, told me it was none of my business, and that I should not have been picking up young women from the side of the road anyway. I still do not know what happened to that girl, and I hope she has gotten the treatment she needs. A part of me wonders if I had helped prolong some sort of horrible cycle of abuse, one which the actual police were complicit. Last night, my boyfriend and I were driving home from Universal Studios in Orlando. We were rerouted away home we have never gone before, and we're traveling basically in the middle of nowhere. My boyfriend's speedometer is broken on his car, and he must press the button to reset the miles after he gets gas. This will be especially important soon. We were driving on a deserted road in the middle of absolute nowhere with not one car in sight. My boyfriend realized we hit the 130-mile mark on his odometer. That means we needed gas. But there was literally not one gas station in sight. I put the search in my phone for a gas station nearby, and we found one. It turned out to be closed. In a hurry, we found another gas station 5 minutes up the road. This is where the story truly gets weird. My boyfriend thought he closed his gas cap after he filled up, and we were once again driving along this deserted road. We heard a loud bang and realized he forgot to put the gas cap back on. So we are driving around this dark road looking for the gas cap. He finally pulls over and realizes somehow the gas cap is still attached to the car. We get back on track to the other gas station. Out of nowhere, I had a horrible thought about something going wrong at that gas station. I pushed it aside as best as I could, because I knew we needed gas and AAA is not an option where we were. We get to this gas station and the lights are kind of on. This road literally leads to a dead end with a gas station on it. The only way to leave this area was to turn left or go straight out of the gas station. My boyfriend got out of the car to see if we could get gas, and the feeling intensified. I have literally never felt like that in my entire life. My stomach dropped into my butt. I have been in very disturbing situations, such as almost being kidnapped twice, being followed home, watching someone being taken away in a body bag after being hit by a car, and even some paranormal situations. I can talk about this sometime in the future, but I have never, ever felt like this before. I saw a white car pulling up the road, and it looked like it was going to make a left. Keep in mind, there is literally no one on this road. He pulls up and notices my boyfriend, and comes back up with his windows down. I found this very strange because my boyfriend has a genuinely nice sports car, and my mind immediately went to panic mode. I started screaming his name, and the man realized that someone else was in the car. He turned left and sped off suddenly. Sadly, I did not get his license plate because of how dark it was. The situation frightens me more than you can even imagine. It may not seem too scary, but it was easily one of the most terrifying things to watch because I did not know if I was going to witness my boyfriend being robbed at gunpoint or something like that. The feeling and thought I just had 10 minutes earlier are what also made the situation even worse. We found a gas station with actual human life around, and we made it home safe and sound. Once I got home, my dad told me that that road we were driving on was famous for many bodies being found on it. I hope no one gets put in that situation. Be safe out there, my friends. I started my career working in sawmills back in 2007. I was hired for a portable sawmill in southwest Washington state. This mill was located quite literally in the middle of a forest. It was constructed in the early 1970s, and even in the short 30 years of its life, it seemed to have a decent amount of history inside of it. I worked the weekend graveyard shift, 2:30 p.m. to 4:30 a.m. the following day, on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. I was a trim drop operator. I had a partner who I was with. We were the only two who worked in this area. His name is Pete. We would take turns rotating through the night. One of us would run the drop, where you would drop out bad boards, chunks of garbage, and just anything else that could not be made into quality lumber. The boards that would be left to be processed would enter a lugged, chained system, and then be pulled through a scanner, and then a trim box that would cut the lumber to length, and then take them to the next area, which was the sorter. The other of us would sit at an operator's console about 20 feet away and watch monitors that displayed various parts of the machine and process flow. We rotate every few thousand boards to keep from being fatigued. One night, I was running the drop, and Pete was kicked back at the console station reading away at the newspaper. Everything was just going normal as ever, when I glanced over and noticed him peering up at the monitor or the outfeed with a puzzled look on his face. He jumped up and went walking down to the trimmer saw box and looked around it. He also looked at the outfeed. He then walked back looking quite concerned, sat down, shrugged, and started reading again. This happened a second time, and by now it had my attention. I threw up the skids to stop the flow of lumber and walked over to him and asked him what was up. There was a guy standing at the outfeed. I went down there to see what the hell was going on, and when I got there, he was gone, he said, with a confused look on his face. This did not make sense, because this was an area that was not accessible unless you stopped the machine and activate a catwalk that unfolds from the outfeed of the saw to allow access to a small platform on the opposite side of the machine as we operate it from. I asked him to point out where the guy was hanging. Pete pointed to the platform, slightly frustrated. I shook my head at him and laughed, before running back to the drop to continue running lumber. Pete stayed fixed on the monitors now, newspaper folded up and thrown to the side. No more than 5 minutes go by before he jumps up and runs down to the saw box and outfeed again. This time, I threw the skids up and followed him. By the time we got there, there was nothing. He pointed across the lumber table, which was 30 feet wide, to the platform across the machine and yells, "Who's over there? You aren't allowed to be over here, god dang it." Both of us waited to see a man who had been on the monitor, but once again, there was nothing there. After a minute or two of looking, we decided to move back to our stations. I walked by the console station, glancing at the monitor, seeing nothing, and Pete followed shortly behind. By the time I made it to the drop to start running again, Pete howled. I snapped over and saw him stabbing the monitor with his finger. He yelled at me to come look. I ran over and investigated the monitor. Sure enough, there was a guy. He was standing on the small platform Pete had pointed out. The monitor is small, grainy, and black and white, but we can work out that this guy is wearing a tin hard hat, a very dirty and worn button-up long sleeve with the sleeves either rolled up or ripped off, and a very thick denim jeans of a dark color. He is just standing there, with his elbows on the handrail looking at the lumber from the saw box. "Wait here," Pete yelled as he stealthily snuck down to the outfeed. As he closed in on the outfeed area, to catch this guy red-handed for being in an area you cannot or should not be able to access while in operation, I looked back and forth at Pete and the monitor. About the time Pete made it to the saw box, the man on the monitor looked up into the camera and literally just faded away. I completely lost my cool. I felt a cold chill run down my back, accompanied by all the hairs on my arms standing up. I sprinted as quickly as I could to Pete, exclaiming, "That ain't a guy. It's no guy." Pete just stood there dumbfounded. Both of us knew that we were looking at an empty platform, and we had no idea what we should do. We were quite disturbed now. Pete crossed his arms in thought before deciding we should call our foreman down to tell him this story. We walked back to the operator's station and Pete grabbed the mic of the radio and called for the foreman. We ran operations until he arrived, both of us ready to bolt for the saw box in case we saw the entity again. The foreman showed up about 5 minutes or so later, and we stopped running and explained what had happened. The foreman did not look impressed, but he was smiling. He explained that we had probably just seen one of the old-timers. Back in the late 70s, we had a man who worked here who ran the chip bin station, and one day, arrogance got the best of him. Long story short, he got buried in a chip pile and was crushed and suffocated before he could get dug out. As homage to his previous career as a logger in the woods, people think that his ghost roams these halls. Other operators have had occurrences where they have witnessed this entity wandering around different machines, seemingly just watching the flow of lumber. Although what I'm about to tell you may sound like one of your run-of-the-mill horror movies, I swear the validity of it and what I saw. It all started on an extremely hot July day this past year. My car is almost 20 years old and sometimes overheats on hot days, just like this one. However, until I get a better paying job, it is the car I'm stuck with. This day I was driving through the back roads looking for a family of dog breeders a friend had told me about. I had been searching for the place for several hours and was approaching the warmest part of the day. As per usual, my car began overheating and I was forced to pull over. I picked up my phone to call my girlfriend only to see that my battery was dead After I spent a couple of minutes cussing my luck, I acknowledged that I was going to have to find someone with a working phone. That was not going to be very easy, unfortunately, as I was out in the middle of nowhere. And, unfortunately, that was also not going to happen unless I started walking. Soon, I spotted an old farmhouse off in the distance and headed toward it. A trip that would have taken a half an hour on a normal day took almost an hour because of the oppressive heat. I had to take several breaks during the journey, but eventually made it. The area around the house looked more like a junkyard, parts of old cars spread about, and I had to weave through a maze of them to try to reach the front door. I knocked on the door for several minutes but got no answer. Thinking maybe that the homeowner may be hard of hearing, I walked around and investigated the windows, hoping to see someone inside. At the side of the house, I spotted a telephone hanging on the wall just inside the kitchen. Now that I knew there was a phone there, I became excited and started calling out for someone. Even after walking all the way around, no reply came. I was about to give up until I saw a woman laying on a bed. I nearly banged on the window to try to get her attention, but I figured that may scare her, so I went back to the front door and let myself in. In hindsight, that was just as scary. Before I entered, however, I took a piece of paper from a notebook I carry with me and wrote out a note explaining what I was doing there. Even then, I called out several times as I approached the bedroom. Still no answer. I continued toward the room. The closer I got to the woman, the more her appearance began to unnerve me. She was lying flat on her back and staring blankly at the ceiling. I had initially believed she was watching the television that was turned on in the room with her, but her eyes sat completely still. Regardless, I got closer, and once I was within a few steps, I handed her the note. When the note touched her hand, she did not react. This caused me to get closer, and this is when I realized something was very wrong. Her face had a very dry, almost mummified look to it. Her hair was a vibrant black, a color not often seen on older females. She had to have known I was there by that point, but her eyes stayed fixated. This is what caused me to lean in even closer and look into her eyes. Rather than being slightly bloodshot or moist looking like most people's, they had a shiny, glassy appearance, like they were fake. Despite this, not until I touched her did I know for sure that she was dead. I realized that perhaps she was a mannequin rather than a human, so I reached down and touched her bare hand. The texture of her skin was dry, but stone cold to the touch. The oddity of this just beginning to really sink in when a loud creaking noise came from behind me. Without a second thought, I tore out of there and ran back down the road in the direction of my car. Within a half a mile, I ran into an older man in a truck, and he agreed to give me a ride into town. I said nothing about my experience to him, and anytime he attempted to make small talk, I said as absolutely little as I could. He let me borrow his phone to call my girlfriend, and she agreed to meet us at a gas station on the edge of town. When he let me out there, I thanked him and he went on his way. Once I was safely inside my girlfriend's car, I borrowed her phone and called the police. I had not even told her about it yet, so the look of shock on her face as I described what I saw showed me what my expression likely was at the time when I discovered it. The cops said they would send a car out to the house to check out my claims. I called a wrecker next to pick up my car. The police never called me back, so after waiting 3 days I called to inquire about what they found. It took a few moments to find a person aware of my call, but once I did, the officer said that he and his partner searched the entire property and found nothing out of the ordinary, especially not a mummified woman. I thanked them and hung up. What happened after I fled, I can only guess. The noise behind me was probably the owner of the home, and he hid the woman's body, knowing that the cops were likely to be called. To tell you the truth, I am not sure what I saw in that house on that bed. I am positive that I saw a human laying on the bed, but that is all. More than once I have been tempted to grab a camera and return to that house to get proof of my claims, but fear of the unknown and what else could be waiting for me if I did has stopped me. If the nightmares of her soulless eyes continue, however, I may have no other choice. A few months back, one of my friends had opened up to me about a creature he said he encountered 2 times around New Jersey, where my mother lives. This same friend and I have encountered a skinwalker in the past while being in New Jersey, and he told me when he was just a boy, he saw something in the fields next to his house out in the middle of nowhere. Whatever he saw still terrifies him to this day. He has had 2 encounters with this so-called creature, one in the middle of the day when he was a boy, and one while waking up in the middle of the night. Here are his encounters with an alleged Dogman. These stories are also from his perspective, so I could capture the narrative. I hope you enjoy his stories. Hi, my name is Todd, and I have lived in New Jersey all of my life. Since I was a kid, I had all sorts of paranormal and creature experiences, which I can also tell here in the future at some point. I am a heavy believer in the supernatural, and in Dogman and other cryptids, just like my friend Sam. Here are 2 of my encounters with what I believe are Dogman. It was a clear sunny day as I was walking alongside a trail that was close to my house. I was only around 7 or 8 years old at the time. It was so beautiful out that day, and as a young kid, I was taking it all in. I was having an absolute adventure, picturing myself just running through the open fields waiting for my mom and dad to get home. The trail I was on has beautiful scenery all around, with tall grass for miles. To my left, there was a dense forest to my right. I just was walking through the woods, as whenever my parents were not home, I would just explore. I was enjoying the walk, taking in all the feels of the nature. The smell of the wood was intoxicating, as well as the chirping birds. Then the woods fell silent. I felt like someone or something was watching me, and my eyes darted around the entire area. I then looked to my left and noticed something in the tall grass. To me, it looked like a big dog, but then I saw that it was crouched down like a man would be if it were hiding. He was covered in brown fur. It looked like it had a muzzle and ears like a German shepherd, and had eyes that were blood red. I thought it was more curious than frightening at the moment, but I was still on edge. I was scared for a bit, but I acted like I did not notice it and just went along my day and ran back to my house. I never really spoke about this encounter with anyone of my family, as they would probably think that I was crazy, but that was my first encounter with what I think was a Dogman. The second encounter only happened about 4 or 5 years ago if my memory serves me correctly. At this point in time, I lived in a different house. The house was close to a large forest, and the biggest predators I have seen around here were either coyotes or foxes. Now, what I saw that night was no coyote. I woke up in the middle of the night with my throat dry and realized I was thirsty. I went to the kitchen to get some water when I felt the sudden sense of dread and felt like I was being watched. I investigated the window close to where I was, and to my shock and horror, I saw this huge animal in my backyard. Whatever it was had noticed me, and it was staring at me with these crimson red eyes. I felt utterly terrified, and to my horror, I saw the animal bare its teeth at me and stand up on 2 legs. This creature then started growling, and I could hear it as my window was open slightly. I also saw its breath come out of its mouth, and I realized this thing was a real animal. It looked to be about 7 or 8 feet tall on both legs, with the head of a German shepherd and a body shaped just like a bodybuilder. Whatever this thing was then looked at my fence in my yard, ran to it, and jumped across it into the woods below. I went back to my bed, terrified and could not sleep for the rest of that night. These 2 encounters with these beings have shook me to the core and made me realize that there are creatures that science refuses to recognize out there. Be safe, be careful, and be sure to never explore the woods without being armed in some manner. Dogman on the Highway by Mark L. My encounter happened 3 years ago. I had been helping a friend of mine, Brandon, get his car running. I spent a couple of days and a couple of nights helping him out, and on the 4th and final night, we got his car running and wanted to test drive it before getting on the highway. Brandon and his son got into the two-door car. We left Brandon's yard, and instead of going to the highway, we went down this dirt road, which ended in a roundabout. There are no houses down there, so we made the roundabout. We were heading back to Brandon's house. Myself and his son had to use the restroom pretty bad, so we stopped at the side of the road. Right when Brandon had his hand on the door and I had my hand on my door, that's when someone or something landed on the hood of his car. It shook the car violently, so violently that Brandon and I looked at each other and said, "What the hell was that?" It absolutely woke all of us up, I'll tell you that. None of us were asleep per se, but, none of us were super vigilant at the moment. Brandon turned on the headlights to see if anything was in the road. I turned on the dome light inside the car and I looked down for a split second, and that's when I heard Brandon say, "Mark, look." As I looked up and out the windshield, I saw it. It was a massive dog on two legs. I could make out the muscles on its arms and see some of the veins. It had claws for fingers, which had to be 18 to 20 inches long. They looked absolutely thick as well, and its hair was an orangish reddish color. It had to be at least 10 feet tall. Then I saw the eyes, which looked like embers of a fire. That's how the eyes glowed. It was almost like a ball of energy was burning from within this creature. I saw my life flash before my eyes. When I realized exactly what I was looking at, everything I had read about online completely crushed my thought process. Then Brandon and I both looked at each other again. We both said, "I'm glad you're here because nobody is going to believe us." I was so shaken up by what I was looking at, I couldn't speak until the following day. As fast as it happened, it was gone. We could tell the creature was angry because it couldn't figure out how to get into the car to get us. It could have easily gotten us out if it really wanted to, but thank God it didn't. I'm glad we never got out of the car to relieve ourselves when I got home that summer night. I was as white as my shirt, and my mom asked me why I was so shaking and terrified. I couldn't really speak. I only told my mom about what happened the night before the following morning, and she didn't believe me at first, but I kept repeating myself about the eyes of the creature. It was a werewolf or a dogman that I encountered, and I'm sure of it. I've been wanting to share my encounter, but I've been afraid to share it because I don't want people to think I'm crazy, because I know I'm not. That encounter changed my life, and I barely slept for a couple of weeks because of what I saw. The eyes of that creature still haunt me. I've never returned to that location, but I know where it is. I'd like to return, but I definitely don't want to go alone. Unexplained Experiences on the Res by Dog Mom. My family and I have lived on a reservation in Idaho, the Nez Perce Reservation, in a tiny community for most of my life. We have lived here for 17 plus years, and I have experienced many strange things that we can't quite explain. We have even seen odd skylights around and above our house. I've seen orbs in our backyard. We heard strange noises at night too, which made our hair stand up and gave us an uneasy feeling. But one night, everything we experienced didn't even remotely compare to what happened. It was during the fall, probably late October if I had to guess, close to Halloween, when I went outside in the morning to feed our dogs. We had a whole pack of dogs and utilized our garage as a doggy area for them. They had air conditioning and a heater, and the doors were locked, so they were all safe out there. Nothing could get in, and they couldn't get out. So I went out to feed them, let them run around and get their exercise. Everything was fine. I put them up, locked the doors, and cleaned their air conditioning so the cold air could keep them cool. At this time, everything is fine and normal like usual, until at night, around 8 or 9 p.m., my brother goes out to feed them, and he comes back to the house crying and freaking out, telling me that our dog Dottie is dead. Panicking, my mom and sister went out to my brother to see what was going on. I stayed in the house with my dad. My sister came back in and told me what happened. She said that our dog Dottie had been cut open and drained. Shocked and in disbelief as to what she was saying, I wanted to go see for myself. She told me not to. It was gruesome, but I didn't listen. I walked out there, and to my surprise, what my sister said was entirely true. Our dog was perfectly cut open. Some of her ribs were missing, Some of her intestines were missing, and her blood was like completely gone. My brother and mom were checking the area, and the other fur kids we had, and they were all clean but terrified and scared. They were all shaking in the corner. I started crying and ran back to the house, shocked at what I saw. Of course, my sister told me, "See, I told you not to go out there." I couldn't speak. I was in shock, thinking what or who could do that. All the locks were still locked, all the windows had screens so nothing could get in. Once I calmed down, I asked my sister what she thought happened. Knowing that we always have weird lights over our house, she thought that maybe it was something not from our planet. My family and I believe in the supernatural, cryptid, and the paranormal, among other things, but we don't know what happened. But whatever spooked us, we live in the same house, which has yet to happen again, and I hope it never again does. We still see strange lights, though. So, if it was something extraterrestrial, I really wonder what they were doing. Creepy Figure at School by Mixed Lawn Mower. To this day, I'm unsure if I'm overreacting, but this happened a while back when I was in high school. I don't know if I was tripping, but here it is. I took an earth science class in my freshman year of high school. My teacher played this educational video about the Earth's physicality and tectonic plates or something like that. The video was directed more toward teenagers and younger audiences because the interviews and graphics were colorful and felt like a Bill Nye video. During the video, they interviewed these geologists and they explained absolutely everything about everything. However, during one section of the interview, as they were interviewing different scientists, this ominous-looking girl with tattered clothing, she looked a lot like the girl from The Ring, appeared in the background. After each B-roll cuts back to the scientist, the girl got closer and closer and closer until her face was finally in front of the scientist just glaring at her. Initially, I thought it was some sort of prank that the video was pulling, even though it was weird to do such a scary thing in an educational video meant for kids and young teens, with absolutely nothing to do with horror elements. But the creepiest part was that none of the class was reacting to what I saw. Absolutely no one. And keep in mind, my classmates were all high school freshman kids that are bound to say something, at least about what they were seeing. But no reaction at all. No comments, not even a gasp. I just straight watched the video and looked around at everyone and no one was overreacting or even seemingly noticing it. So, I don't know what happened. Did I mess up? Was I tripping? Am I in some sort of other timeline? I don't know how to explain this experience. This happened a while ago but still haunts me. I really don't know how to compartmentalize it. And if I hadn't had a friend with me who saw and experienced the exact same thing, I would chalk it up to something I imagined. I'll keep my name and my friend's name out of this story, as I don't want notoriety for it. But I would like to explain exactly where it happened, as I would love to hear if anyone else has experienced anything similar to what my friend and I experienced that night. This happened back on October 13th, 1988. It was cold, and it was a Thursday evening. My friend and I had been at the University of Northern Iowa in Cedar Falls, Iowa, since August, and it was our freshman year. We lived in some of the oldest dorms on campus. Her in Lother Hall, and me in Bartlett Hall. We were just out for a walk after finishing studying and we both felt like wandering and exploring. My friend had heard that they were working on making a haunted house in Lother, and that some of her friends were working on it, so we decided to try and find where it was happening. Neither of us were awfully familiar with the full layout of the hall, so we were just kind of bumbling around, seeing what we could see. Apparently the haunted house was being made in the attic, so we made our way up the stairs to the highest level. However, the large doors at the very top of the center stairwell were locked and had dark fabric hanging from them on the other side. We could not hear anyone talking or moving on the other side, so we figured we would check out the floor below it. Down to the next floor, we found a very quiet floor with dorm rooms, and the width of the center stairwell was where a fire door was up to the right. And to the left, there was another fire door.
but the door on the left looked older and was painted wood, not steel like the other. A quick look through the door to the right showed us a continuation of the hallway and more dorm rooms. Walking over to the door on the left, we noticed that there was a bathroom door to the left of the wooden door. This will be important later. I tried the handle on the door, and it would not turn. Believing it to be locked, I figured that was the end of exploring that floor. As I was turning away, I heard a metallic sound and my friend gasped in surprise. She said she grabbed the knob and then it turned in her hand the opposite direction she was going to turn it, and then she pulled away from it. I turned around quickly to see her now looking into a dark room with a now partially open door. My friend carefully pushed the door open wider and walked in looking around for a light switch. She had walked in far enough that I could no longer see her very well, and I looked along the left-hand side of the door frame for a light switch, finding nothing at what I felt would be the normal height for a switch. I arced my arm wider and found an antiqued style switch that it was about head height. Just as I was about to flip the switch, the light came on, but instinctively, I still flipped the switch, shutting them back off again. Again, my friend gasped, and I flipped the switch back, turning the lights back on. She had found another switch on a large timber pillar farther into the room. Looking around, we saw a large room, easily 100 feet long and 40 to 50 feet wide. There were two large dark wood staircases that crisscrossed each other that led up to a loft area that lined the walls. Large windows lined the room, as well as old-style hospital beds from the early 1900s. There was also an old-style wheelchair that looked like it had old ECG machines or something on it. On the other far end of the room, there was another door like the one we had entered, and there was light coming from under the door. While we were both fascinated by the room, something just felt wrong, like we were not supposed to be there. We both just left without saying much and just assumed that might be part of the setup for the Halloween house. Much later, my friend was talking to another one of her friends about the haunted house and asked how the hospital set ties into the whole thing. She was met with a blank stare. Long story short, this leads her to ask me what I remember about the room. I mentioned the large windows. We looked off on the side of Lothar Hall and could find no such windows. I suggested to my friend that we look to possibly find some sort of blueprints, or maybe we can look for the door again, but we were never able to find it. We explored everywhere, but upon us finding this set of windows that kinda looked like it, we looked into it, and we could see that there was nowhere near enough room to have a second floor loft and large windows like we saw. We tried doing research to find out if Lothar Hall ever had a room like that, and maybe tore it down, but no luck. In 1991, we got the help of a couple of resident assistants to get us a key to check out what was on the other side of that door. Entering now, the low-pitched ceilings, tiny alcoves with small windows, and lots of junk and storage. Wandering farther into the back of the attic storage space, we found several of the hospital bed frame heads and footboards in a much greater state of decay. The wheelchair and the machine thing, all covered in thick dust and cobwebs. I don't know what was happening that day. I don't know if we stumbled upon some alternate dimension, maybe some portal slip in time. I have no idea. Maybe it was another timeline, another universe. I don't know. But I just remember how things felt so wrong when we stumbled into that room. I wondered what would have happened if we stayed there too long, and where we would be now. When I was a kid, I do not recall what age I was, but I think I was in like 5th grade. A buddy of mine lived up the road. Every time I would walk past his house, every hair on my body would stand up. To give you more of an idea of what was going on in that house, there were times where I would walk past and look up at the attic window. I would see the face of some little girl and a tall man standing behind her. It was always a sign of something going to happen. See, my buddy, who I will call R, his parents never went in the attic. No one did, honestly. They always kept it locked. They knew something was in the house. I have a few scary memories that happened in that house, but I'm just going to share this one for the time being. This is one of the scariest things that happened to me there. I was staying the night at R's house. The room was on the second floor, immediately to the right of the top of the steps. Next to his room were his parents' room. On the other side of the stairs, on the left, was his brother's room. On the far side left of the room was R's sister's room and the bathroom next to her room. The attic door was on the opposite side of the room from the stairs. I was in R's room sleeping at the time. I woke up to use the bathroom, but it took me a minute to get up because I had a bad vibe about the hallway. My gut was telling me to go back to bed, but as a kid, I was not able to hold my bladder too long. So, I half asleep walked across the hall to the open door, into the bathroom. And then, I walked back to my bed. I saw the attic door slowly opening as I was walking back though. I saw what looked like a little hand wrap its fingers around the door. Then I saw the little girl from the attic pop her head around. The attic door was about 15 feet away from the bathroom. I see her head and closed the bathroom door and leaned up against it so it could not open. That is when I hear the little girl say, "Open the door." But there was something about her voice, it was off. It didn't sound human. I was scared and crying and said no. That is when the doorknob started wiggling, and it felt as if something was going to rip the door off its hinges at any moment. It went on like this for what felt like 20 minutes. I heard stomping away from the door and what sounded like someone walking up wooden stairs. The attic was the only place with wooden stairs in the house, so I knew it had to be going back to the attic. I waited for a few minutes to be safe. I peeked out the door and saw the attic door shut. I was scared, but I thought maybe it was R playing a trick on me. But he is the youngest in the house besides me. He doesn't have a little sister, so I reckon that it can't really be a joke. I went to check the attic door, but it was locked. I ran back to R's room, where he was still passed out. I tried like heck to go back to sleep, and finally did. When me and R woke up the next morning, he noticed I had a handprint on the back of my neck. It was huge. When he went to change his shirt, I saw he had fresh scratches on his back as well. We got dressed and went to my house, and he stayed the night at my house. I remember this day like it was yesterday. My hands are trembling just thinking about it. I will never forget the sound of her voice telling me to open the door.
This happened when I was in college, 4 years ago. I went to a university that was very close to an ocean on the East Coast. I made friends with some people on the weekend, and one guy in the group of people I met invited us to go out on his boat with him. He described his boat to a bunch of people, and was very proud to have it. It sounded like an expensive sailboat by the way he described it. Not really familiar with boats, and hadn't ever really been on one other than a cruise ship when I was like 11. This guy said his parents bought one for him, and that made sense because he was known to be a spoiled kid. He was nice enough though, and the idea of cruising around some Saturday afternoon and drinking some beers sounded appealing. After that conversation, I saw him around in school, but didn't really talk to him much, until one day he approached me in the library and asked if I still wanted to go sailing. I said sure, that sounded awesome, and he told me the following day he was going out on the water, and it would be a perfect opportunity for me to join him. After a lengthy conversation about how sailing works, and him assuring me it was safe and he had all the proper training, I told him I'd meet him at the docks the next morning. That night, my roommate asked me what I was doing for the weekend, and I told him that I made plans to go out sailing. He freaked out on me and told me he really wished he could go, and that I was sure that the other guy would be cool with it. The next morning, my roommate and I grabbed some coffee and grabbed some beer to bring along with us on our voyage. We ate some breakfast, and then we headed over to the docks to meet the guy. We were pretty excited, and when we got there, we followed the direction he gave me and found his boat. It was a huge orange and white sailboat. We stood on the dock next to the boat looking at it, when the guy popped his head up from somewhere
and immediately showed a look of concern on his face. He jumped off the side of the boat onto the dock next to us. He looked at my roommate and then myself and asked, "Who is this?" I told him he was my roommate. He was cool and that he had asked if he could come along. I told him I didn't think he would mind. The guy looked very annoyed, and it was awkward as hell for a few moments. The guy kept looking back and forth at the boat and then us. He took his hat off and rubbed his head like he was really stressed out. Eventually he sighed and said it was fine. I'll fast forward now to the part of the story that was scary as hell. A few hours later, we were on the boat, drinking and having fun. The water was pretty smooth sailing, and the sun was shining bright on us. The guy acted a bit off the whole time, and I figured it was because I brought my roommate. After drinking 3 or 4 beers, I felt the courage to ask the guy what was wrong, and if he was still pissed I brought my roommate. He responded with something along the lines of, "It just kind of ruined my plans." My roommate chimed in, with a smile on his face, and asked the guy, "What plans?" I could tell my roommate thought it was funny because it sounded like the guy wanted to be alone with me. The guy looked at him and said, "Well, because you're here, I can't kill him." This took me off guard completely, and I felt fear and unbelievable relief hit me at the same time. My roommate and this guy started cracking up, and my roommate brushed it off as a joke. I honestly didn't know what to think. Was this guy serious? Did I avoid being killed by this asshole? Is his sense of humor just that weird? I believe I got my answer when I went below the deck an hour later to grab another beer from the fridge. Next to his fridge was a brown swinging door that led to a small private bedroom quarters. I was feeling the beer pretty good by this point, and without thinking, pushed the door open. Laying on the foot of the bed was a big-ass cinder block, some yellow rope, tape, and what looked like a recorder of some sort. After seeing that, I felt sick to my stomach and wanted off that boat as soon as possible. I wanted to go back up and confront the guy, but decided against it because of what he might have been on, who knows what he was capable of. Could be on some serious drugs or even worse. What seemed like hours and hours more of being with this guy, we finally made it back to the dock. We said our goodbyes, and on the way back to my room, I told my roommate about what I had seen. He couldn't believe it. I'm pretty damn sure that my roommate saved my life that day by wanting to go with me. And I kid you not, I never saw that guy again on campus. What he had planned, I don't know. And I really don't want to think about it.
This story takes place on a lake in central New Hampshire, just a few miles north of the base of Mount Kearsarge. My friend has a cabin there, and his grandfather built it shortly after returning from the Second World War, and one warm summer night between my junior and senior years of high school, he and I were there, just hanging out. While we did drink and partake in the ganja from time to time, we were not intoxicated in any way on this night. We had simply been bored in our little hometown about 30 miles or approximately 48 kilometers to the south. So on a whim one evening, we decided to drive up and spend the night there, to light a fire and sit by the water on the beach chairs, and enjoy the nighttime t-shirt and swimming trunks weather while it lasted. I would say it was around 9 or 10 p.m., and we had gotten up to inspect his grandfather's old canoe that laid upside down atop the wooden dock because we wanted to use it the next day to head to the lone island to look for loon nests and try to catch some catfish. As we walked to the dock from where we had been sitting, I gazed across the lake at Mount Kearsarge. The mountain has a height of 2,937 feet, or 895 meters, and a prominence of 2,080 feet, or 630 meters. So, since it was basically 2,000 feet straight up from our position, as we were only a couple of miles from its summit, it was quite an imposing figure in the night sky. Now the mountain has a tower on the peak that flashes a red light at night. There is only one light, and it is red. I had seen it many times before. It was just a fact, however, as I followed my friend to the dock that I noticed there were more than 2 lights on this night. In addition to the usual red flashing light, there was a second, yellowish-orange orb to its right, essentially equidistant in height. It was not moving, flashing, pulsating, nothing. It just hung there, motionless in the night sky. I told my friend, who was immediately interested, and so we were both just stood there, transfixed for a while before he asked me what the hell I thought it was. I would have immediately considered a helicopter, but it was just so still and silent. After just a few moments of silent staring, we both shrugged our shoulders and continued down to the canoe at the end of the dock. We inspected it for a while, placing it in the lake to check for leaks, and decided that it was good to go, which was exciting, as we were really looking forward to getting on the water. After lugging it back to the original resting position, I turned to my right and bent down to wash the cobwebs off my fingers in the lake. As I was doing this, I returned my gaze to the mountain, and to my amazement, there were now 2 identical orbs, one on either side of the red flashing light. I smacked my friend across the shoulder and told him to look up, and again, we just stared transfixed, albeit this time a little more anxiety-ridden. "What the hell?" my friend said, with a bit of fear creeping into his voice. Without averting our gaze, we backpedaled to our chairs and began discussing possibilities. It is important to note that both of us were science-believing realists, and still are to this day. We both accepted the distinct possibility that we, humanity, were most likely not alone in this never-ending galaxy, let alone the universe. Something, all the grains of sand on Earth. You know, the old Carl Sagan adage. So as we sat, discussing both the Fermi paradox and the likelihood that it was just some sort of temporary, human-made thing going on top of the mountain, something happened. Before our eyes, one of the orbs slowly descended below the backside of the mountain and out of sight. I'm sorry, I know I am no aeronautical engineer or anything, but I know what a helicopter looks like when it descends in elevation. This was not like that at all. It sunk down and out of sight in less than just a few seconds, very smoothly, all without making any lateral movement whatsoever. We were stunned, but before we had time to wallow in this feeling or think that we could have possibly seen something unnatural, the other orb took off from its position. It did not gain or lose any elevation. It just took off horizontally at breakneck speed and began to make its way around the edge of the lake. It was not until the light was about halfway between its starting point and our position that we began to consider that it might be heading straight for us. We stood still at the shore and followed the objects with our eyes. Out of sheer curiosity and without speaking, we both made an unconscious decision to wait and see what would happen. I mean, what else were we supposed to do? At no point did we talk or look at each other. We just stood there, watching. Without leaving you in suspense for too long, the object did eventually arrive to where we were, and upon its arrival, it slowed to a crawl and crept over us at a snail's pace. It was big. Not stereotypically mothership big, but big. I do not know exactly, but if I had to estimate, I would say it was about 50 meters in length by 30 meters in width. It was shaped like a fat cigar, and had 2 or 3 rows of orange lights on its bottom. I cannot tell you what my friend was doing or how he was reacting at this time, for I was entranced. I remember thinking that I had never had an opportunity to view something like this, and I probably would never get another chance again. It was a once-in-a-lifetime experience, so I stared intensely, examining anything and everything about it that I could. Unfortunately, there were not many details that I could make out, only its approximate dimensions and the rows of lights. It made no real sounds aside from what I perceived to be a very, very faint humming. There were no beams of light shooting down at us or anything like that. We stood in the pitch blackness of the late New Hampshire night, and I remember preparing myself for something to happen to us. But as far as I know, nothing ever did. As soon as it had crept its way past us, it took off as fast as it had appeared, up into the night sky and out of sight. At that point, I shot my head back across the lake towards the mountain. There was nothing but the normal, flashing red light remaining. All appeared to be back to normal. I do not think we said anything to each other aside from, "Let's get out of here," or something to that effect, before grabbing what little we had brought with us and hightailing it back to my friend's car. We drove the 30 miles back to our hometown, purchased some snacks at the convenience store, and returned to his house, where we proceeded to set up the same beach chairs that we had brought with us to the lake in his backyard, where we stayed up for most of the night, talking about what the hell we had just seen. For the next few weeks, my mind had hardly focused on anything else. I told my parents at some point, but they sort of just laughed it off, telling me that it must have been a helicopter or something like that. And after their reaction, I decided not to tell anyone else. Not until I was older and gave no crap about what people would think of me. It was only then that I began to tell my trusted friends about what happened that night. My friend and I have since parted ways. We live across an ocean from each other now and talk from time to time. In fact, it has been a few years since one of us brought it up. However, sitting here and writing this down, it just now made me want to reach out and talk with him again. I know what I saw, and it was not constructed by humanity. We do not have that sort of technology, at least, not that we know of. And if we do, there is far more hidden from the average citizen of the Earth than I thought possible. But I am digressing into conspiracy theories now, and that is a path that I try not to go down. The fact is that the possibility that we are alone in the universe is so microscopically small. Consider this. There are billions of planets out there that are much, much older than Earth. All it would take is one of them to have developed intelligent life a few million years before us, giving them a massive head start in the development and technology scheme that would allow them to create machines that could do what these objects are. Thank you for sharing my story, Swamp Dweller. I hope you enjoyed it. Something Mimicked His Voice by Taco Skeva. Two peculiar incidents happened to me one night involving the same friend and my need to use the bathroom. It was around 10 p.m. when I felt the urgent need to use the restroom. Our campsite was about a quarter-mile away from the restrooms and was pitch dark outside. Walking along the main path, I saw one of my friends with us at the campsite. He emerged from the path leading to an unused site and joined the main path, which was a good 50 yards away from the path leading to our site. My friend has a very noticeable and peculiar gait, a distinctive way of walking, so I was fairly sure it was not them. At multiple points he turned around and asked, "Why are you following me?" He was always a good 40 or so feet ahead of me. I replied, "I told you guys, I was just going to the bathroom," and questioned him, "Why did you come from a different site?" He picked up his pace, and I eventually lost sight of him in the darkness. I reached the restrooms without seeing him again, took care of my business, and returned to our campsite. When I returned, my friend was already there, acting as if nothing had ever happened. I started asking him why he was messing with me, but everyone denied that he had ever left the campsite. I thought, okay, they're just messing around with me, no big deal. At some time around 3 a.m., I woke up needing to use the bathroom again. This time, there was no need to walk to the restrooms. I decided just to walk off into the woods a little bit. Walking back to the campsite after relieving myself, I heard the distinct sound of a tent zipper opening. I could barely make out my friend in the darkness, but I could listen to him zip it back up. As I got closer to the tents, I saw him more clearly. He stepped out and lit a cigarette. I could see his face illuminated by the sparks from his lighter. Even more apparent when he finally lit his cigarette. He took a puff and said, "Can you hear me?" I replied, "Yeah, I can hear you, what's up?" He repeated much louder this time, "Can you hear me?" I said, "Yeah, what are you trying to do, wake everyone up?" He shook his head at me, then turned and walked toward the cars. I was about 30 feet away from him, thinking he was messing with me again. I decided to follow him. I lost sight of him behind the car, and when I turned the corner, he was nowhere to be seen. I was starting to get angry, thinking he was just trying to be funny. So I returned to his tent, which was still closed, and I could hear him faintly snoring inside. I have no idea what I saw that night. It looked, sounded, and walked just like my friend. I was slightly inebriated, but not enough to hallucinate. My friend denies leaving his tent or walking through the woods ahead of me. What do you guys think? An Encounter in the Deep Woods of ONF by The Carm. Ocala National Forest in Florida is a place of natural beauty, dense woods, and, as I discovered one night, mysterious happenings. This is the story of an unsettling encounter that my friend and I experienced while hunting, which made us question what exactly goes on in those deep woods. My friend and I were hunting in the forest. and we had stayed out past midnight, hoping to find some hogs. As the night wore on, we realized we were much deeper in the woods than we had planned on being, probably 3 or 4 miles from the main road. The dense canopy of the trees above us made the forest dark and foreboding, but the bright moonlight filtering through the trees provided just enough light to navigate by. We were armed with AR-15s, sidearms, and fixed-blade hunting knives in hip sheaths, so we felt confident and unafraid of any threats. I also carried a large, powerful flashlight that could be turned into a strobe or used as a club. We weren't paranoid about anything lurking in the shadows with our lights mounted on the rifles and the moon illuminating our path. We heard something crashing through the woods to our right as we returned. It was moving fast and seemed to about cross the trail ahead. Most of the trails in the Ocala National Forest are fairly wide, old logging roads that form square quadrants out of the forest. This trail was narrower and overgrown, cutting across one of the quadrants. We initially thought it might be a deer or a black bear, but since it was illegal to shoot at night, we opted not to use the rifle lights. Instead, I turned on my handheld flashlight while waiting for the creature to near the trail. As the noise grew closer, I aimed my light toward the sound. To our surprise, all we saw was a pair of white legs crossing the thin trail about 50 feet in front of us. They looked human. We were baffled. What kind of person crashes through the woods at 1 a.m. in shorts, avoiding the trail and plowing through thick brush instead? It made no sense. However, armed, we decided to push on rather than take the extra 30 minutes to turn back and go around the quadrant. We occasionally heard more crashing sounds in the woods as we continued, but they never got close to us again. Finally, we reached my car, which was still intact and untouched, which was a relief. We kept our rifles loaded, shoved our handguns between the seats in the center console, and got into the front seat. I started the car and began driving out of the forest, enjoying the beautiful star-filled sky through the moonroof. It's easy to forget how stunning the night sky can be in the middle of Ocala National Forest. About half a mile down the road, my headlights illuminated a man walking along the route. He wore a checkered-down button-down shirt, shorts with no backpack or supplies. We were miles away from any paved road, and it was another 5 to 10 miles to the nearest town. This was the northern part of the forest, where there were no old cabins or buildings from anything that I could find declared by the national park. The man had no flashlight, didn't even glance at us as we drove past. Was this the same person we saw cross the path earlier? What was he doing out there without supplies or a light at 1:32 a.m.? The situation was bizarre and left us with more questions than answers. As we neared the paved road, we unloaded our rifles, put them in the trunk, and then headed home. Despite the weird encounter, it was a rather enjoyable trip, and I couldn't wait to return. However, I have made a mental note to always be armed in Ocala National Forest. Some bizarre stuff goes on there, and it's honestly better to be prepared for anything. The Skinwalker's Cry by OK Trasho. About 3 or so years ago, I dated this guy. Let's call him Jay for security reasons. He told me a story about when he was younger. He ended up finding this old Ouija board, and of course, being the curious kid he was, he messed with it. From that exact day, his life would be forever changed. An ancient presence would forever seem to haunt and stalk him. Jay always told me that ever since then, he has felt like something watches him and he encounters some pretty creepy things. I didn't know whether to believe him because I had never witnessed anything while with him. I'm spiritual and very open-minded regarding these types of things, especially the supernatural. So that's why to this day, I still think about that one night. It still gives me chills. Jay and I liked to listen to Creepy Encounter podcasts pretty often, and in the back of my mind, I couldn't help but imagine what it would be like if something like that happened to me. You find yourself in that situation that seems straight from a horror podcast or a movie. The kind you used to listen to for thrills, never expecting to live out your own tale. So, one night, my ex and I were winding down for bed watching some scary stories on YouTube. It started with a chilling and distant scream, like a little girl's cry from the shadows. The kind that makes you pause and ask, did I actually just hear that? I muted the TV, and it was again a couple of seconds later, a loud girl screaming. It was like a haunting sound on a loop, breaking the silence of the night. It was such an odd sound. Yes, it sounded like a little girl screaming, but it was just off, like something wanted to lure me outside to investigate. The scream sounded like it was on repeat, as if it were being played over and over again on a recorder. For some reason, all 4 of my cats reacted, gathering and hissing towards the door as if they saw what we couldn't. Then came the tapping, a persistent and sinister rhythm on the windows, doors, and every entrance of the home, as if something unseen was insisted on being let in. This was the most sinister experience I've ever had. After all that, I immediately hid under the bed and J-crawled. My heart beat so loudly that I thought whatever could hear me would definitely come for me first. We held hands as I tried not to make a noise while tears rolled down my face. Finally, after a couple of minutes, everything fell silent, and my ex and I, frozen by fear, chose not to investigate and remained in the safety of our home. But now, in hindsight, part of me wonders what might have happened if we had dared to look. To hear about a story is one thing. To live it is indescribable. The fear is tangible, a thick presence in the air. Every sense is heightened, and every shadow is suspect. It's an experience that blurs a line between the world we see and the one we feel in the pit of our stomach during our most vulnerable moments. No Idea What We Saw by Anonymous. Let me preface this with some facts about myself. I'm not much of a writer or someone who shares stories or anecdotes in written form. I'm usually a talker. I also am not or wasn't a believer in the paranormal. After this experience, I believe in something. This is a relatively short story of an experience I had roughly 3 years ago during my time with my wife. We were having some issues. No idea if that affected the events or not, but it's just a weird correlation that I wanted to throw out there. I was alone, the kids were put to bed late one Sunday night, around October. I had been prepared for a week of work that lay ahead of me and unpacking a lot of stuff from boxes, which were then stacked neatly at the front door of my house. I was trying to do things around the house to impress or please my wife, who had gone to stay with her mother in a neighboring city for some time. We had been having some problems for the better part of a year, so I was feeling lonely and depressed, just generally down on myself that weekend. I lived on the corner of one of the main roads in my town at the time. A giant high school right across the street. Lots of traffic usually, though it slows down around 11 on the road. It's still busy enough that cops would set up traffic stops from time to time into the later hours of the night. The other part of the corner I lived on was a dead-end road with 4 houses, including my own. There was a single guy with an adult son, an elderly single woman, and a couple without kids. It's probably around midnight, and I'm winding down what I'm working on and thinking about going to bed. Suddenly, I hear what sounds like a baby crying. My kids are about 6 and 9 years old at this time, so I checked and it wasn't any of them. It sounds like it's coming from outside. So I peek out the door and see this misshapen thing pretty far off, shuffling up the sidewalk. No more baby sounds by this point. I had stepped outside, and the storm door slammed behind me on accident, causing a loud ruckus, and whatever was in front of us turned around. I couldn't get a good view of it, and by the time it started to turn, I had quickly gone back inside. I don't often get freaked out quickly, but this did the trick. I grabbed a machete saw and closed all the windows, blinds, and curtains. I stood at my closed front door, freaked the heck out. Then I heard footsteps coming toward my door, and they only sounded more like hooves than any sort of human foot. Distorted, high-heeled steps, if you will. After hearing the steps, I waited a few minutes, maybe 5 or so, and then opened the door, machete in hand. The neat stack of broken down boxes was knocked over. It was certainly not knocked over when I got inside, but whatever. Almost everything in my driveway was covered with these boxes now. There was nothing else. No signs of the creature, no footsteps, no sign it had ever existed. I didn't learn until later about the sounds skinwalkers made, which led me here to tell my story. Was it a skinwalker? Are they attracted to loneliness or negative emotions, sadness? Did it try to feed off my fear of thinking it was at my door? For weeks, I was scared it would be there when I rounded the corners of my house. That's pretty much the story, though. Thank you for deciding to share it if you do. Around Thanksgiving of 1969, I had just gotten a job as an entry-level reporter for the Post-Standard, the local newspaper here in Syracuse. I was young. I had my dream job. Life was good. But just 6 weeks later, my entire world came crashing down around me with the arrival of one little letter.
To Daniel Frederick Wilson, you are hereby ordered for induction into the armed forces of the United States.
I had been drafted, and although I'd make a dozen stops at various induction centers, training facilities, and Air Force bases, I was ultimately destined for one place: Vietnam. What followed was 8 weeks of boot camp over at Fort Dix, and for a while, it looked like I was doomed to join the infantry. But due to my degree in journalism, there was a chance I might be able to weasel my way onto the writing staff of Stars and Stripes. Then, just a few days before we were due to graduate, my drill sergeant pulls me into his office with some bad news. Stars and Stripes did not need any more bodies, but there was an opportunity for me to become a military dog handler. It wouldn't keep me out of the field completely, but according to him, all I'd have to do was roll up with my canine, sniff out a few booby traps, and after that, the engineers would roll up, and I'd be back in the rear in a hot minute. But as it turned out, all that stuff about being safely in the rear turned out to be a bunch of bull, because me and Tack, my 3-year-old German Shepherd, ended up in more firefights than I could have possibly imagined. Tack got his name after a particularly close call that occurred on a routine patrol near Cu Chi. We're on point when suddenly Tack, who was called Rex back then, started alerting like crazy. I had never seen him act so downright scared before, and when the lieutenant sees this, he orders his guys to unload their weapons onto the jungle ahead of us. What followed was nothing short of a lead storm, with 5.56, 30 cal, and 40 Mike just tearing up foliage in front of us for a solid minute. When the fire finally stopped, nothing moved, and there was a moment where we thought the whole thing might have been a false alarm. But sure enough, as we pushed through the jungle, we found drag marks, bloody trails, booby traps, the works. If it was not for Tack, there's a chance the entire platoon would have been wiped out. He saved our lives. God dang, boy, I remember this one grunt saying. The hound of yours is sharp as a tack, isn't it? And it just sort of stuck. Tack sniffed out every single ambush we ever came up against, even the one that almost killed him. Some poor grunt managed to snag a tripwire connected to a 125mm tank shell. I don't even really remember the blast. I just remember waking up on my back with someone dragging me back through the jungle. My first thought was for Tack, and as I looked to tell the soldier dragging me to go back for my canine, I saw that it wasn't a soldier at all. It was Tack. He had one of my shoulder straps between his teeth and was dragging me back towards the relative safety of the platoon with all his might. We were putting out a lot of fire, but Charlie was giving as good as they got, and one burst of a machine gun fire ripped up the ground in front of me before I watched a piece of my fatigue pants just pop open. I let out a scream loud enough to wake the dead, begging for the platoon's medic. Only, the next thing I know, I hear Tack let out this almighty yelp before he dived on top of me. I had no idea what just happened, and for a second, I thought he had been shot, but he had not. He was trying to shield me from the bullets. The poor little guy had no idea how the enemy were hurting me. All he knew is that he wanted it to stop, even if it meant putting his body in the way of their bullets. I tried to push him off of me. I tried to keep crawling, but he wouldn't budge, and only when the shooting died down could I shift him. But that time, instead of getting to his feet, Tack just slumped down next to me. He was alive, just barely, and I said that the platoon commander, if he didn't put him on the medic vac with me, that I'd make sure he never received canine support again.
It was a total bluff, but it sure worked. Yet, it takes some considerable amount of time and insubordination to save Tack's life. When we landed back at DAC 2, I carried Tack off the Huey myself before hopping over the medical tent to demand one of the surgeons save his life. "Get that mutt off my operating table, soldier," one of them said. "I'm a doctor, for Christ's sakes, not a veterinarian." I didn't say a word in response. I just pulled out my .45, pulled back the slide, and then pointed it at his head. The surgeon looked at me in the eyes and saw months of firefights, booby traps, and night patrols staring back at him. A moment of silence followed, and then the surgeon got to work saving Tack's life. I'm sure you'll be as pleased as I am to learn that he survived. Turned out to be nothing more than a few shrapnel wounds, and although it took him a while to get back on his feet, Tack did make a full recovery. The incident left the brass in a predicament. I know there was at least one lieutenant colonel who wanted me breaking rocks in Leavenworth, but then there was another who was in the middle of writing me up for a Bronze Star for having saved the lives of half of his battalion. In the end, their decision was more political than disciplinary. Rather than risk angering the rest of the dog handlers and country, the brass just scratched my Bronze Star and gave me a medical discharge instead. I couldn't have cared less about some janky medal because I left Vietnam with the one thing that really mattered to me. Due to the wounds he'd sustained in combat, Tack had to be scrapped from the military's dog program, and it looked like he was headed back to the dog pound back in the US, unless, of course, I stepped in to take ownership of him. That's how I ended up back in Syracuse with my best friend in the world. I was an unemployed 24-year-old with a bum leg and a bad case of PTSD, but I didn't care because I had Tack with me. It took me just short of a year to get back on my feet, and fortunately, I ended up picking up where I left off at the Post-Standard after a chance meeting with the editor. I'll be forever grateful to him for giving me that opportunity, and with the structure and steady income it brought, I gradually got my life together. Then, one day he called me into his office with the proposition of a lifetime. Some editor friend of a friend in DC needed an article written, only the prospective author had just taken ill and couldn't make the assignment. Struggling to find a replacement, he'd fruitlessly called up to their New York desk, which is how it made its way to us. "What's the subject?" I remember asking. "You ever heard of those churches down in Kentucky that handle snakes during their services?" "A little," I replied. "I thought it was illegal. Since when did the law stop anyone from doing anything, kid?" "True, but who's this piece for?" "National Geographic," he said, a smile stretching across his face. "I wouldn't want to go ahead and jinx you by saying this is your big break, but I think we both know what this is. The drive down to Appalachia was going to be one son of a bitch, but since the newspaper was covering my gas money and Tack was used to being on the move, there was nothing stopping me from getting on the road the very next morning. The drive down to Kentucky was a 9.5 hours of watching featureless suburban sprawl slowly erupt into the green rolling hills of the Appalachia, and by the time we got there, my ass was in a coma. Tack did not seem to mind the journey, though. Every so often he'd stick his head out the passenger side window to renew his spirit. That, and when it came to provisions, I had little choice but to buy him a burger at the roadside grease trap, onions, mustard, and all. We rolled into Lexington late afternoon, and to my surprise, getting information on snake-handling churches wasn't all that difficult. All it took was a few pitchers of Budweiser down at the VFW, and I had those crusty old veterans singing like canaries. They told me I'd have to look out on the eastern side of the state if I wanted to talk to any of the old snake handlers, and given that the practice was outlawed, finding them was certainly not going to be easy. That didn't bother me, though. After all, I had Tack with me, and we were used to finding things that did not want to be found. One guy said he hadn't heard of anyone handling snakes in years, but last time he did, it was happening at the old church up in the hills. And so, I set out for the eastern Kentucky hills, with nothing but the name of a small, hillside hamlet called Three Forks. The next morning, I was back on the road driving in the direction of West Virginia, somewhere by the state line. By around 4 hours in, it felt like I had not just traveled 200 miles. It felt like I traveled back in time by around 50 years, too.
It was everything. The old Hudson trucks, dated-looking signage, and by the time I was out near Three Forks, the roads had degenerated into nothing but dirt tracks flanked by dense, dark woods. Every so often, these claustrophobia-inducing country roads would open up into what the locals call hollows, relatively flat areas where the road is sandwiched by homes and small businesses. Frog Pond Hollow was home to the Rabbit's Foot General Store, a place that doubled as both the Hollow's gas station and barber shop. And as I pulled in to top up my gas tank, the clerk wandered out to greet me. "Not often we see New York plates around here," he said, eyeing me suspiciously from across the forecourt. I explained I was in the area on business and that I'd appreciate some gas and a bite to eat. For $1.50, the guy brought me a plate of something he called corn pone pie, which was basically cornbread with beef chili filling, along with a plate of raw hamburger for tack. After I complimented his cooking, he nodded in appreciation before correcting me that it was his wife's, and that I told him he was a lucky man to have such a fine cook at home. He finally began to warm up to me a little. When he asked what kind of business I was on, I didn't want to spoil all the goodwill by telling him that I was a reporter, charged with writing a story on a neighboring community that would well end with them being arrested, so I broke it to him gently. The instant he heard that I was there to write an article about snake handling, I could tell he felt almost tricked into talking to me. "Sir, please hear me out. I just want to tell these people stories," I countered. "This country was founded on the promise of religious freedom, and the fact that snake handlers can be arrested for practicing their faith is frankly un-American. So please help me show the world that these are good people here. Help me get these people their rights back. I fought for this country's freedom in South Vietnam, and damn it, I'll fight for them here too." I think it was the last line that got him. He gave me another look over, then mentioned for me to follow him inside. According to the clerk, almost everyone in the Appalachian knew of at least one church that still took up serpents, as he put it, and it came to no surprise that those who practice it were still persecuted by the state. Three Forks had been the subject of a crackdown on snake handling in the mid-50s, after their pastor almost lost his life to a rattlesnake bite. Since then, they'd taken their rather unique form of worship underground, but a more pertinent question than where are they now was how in the hell did their pastor survive the bite of an eastern diamondback, a snake whose venom is almost 100% fatal when untreated. Victims described the pain of being bitten by one as like two red-hot hypodermic needles piercing your skin and the venom causing the flesh surrounding the bite to blacken and rot. Even worse, the intense swelling of the affected area is said to be one of the worst forms of pain imaginable. But snake handlers vow never to seek medical attention or take any kind of painkillers in the event that they're bitten. Instead, they put their survival in God's hands. Sometimes he comes through for them, others not. I asked the clerk if he knew of any local snake bite fatalities, but he just shook his head. They'd get bitten all right. Not often, but they do. But the way I hear it, they always seem to pull through for some reason. Who knows, maybe the Lord really is looking out for them. It's then that I asked how I'd go about securing an invite to one of these snake handling services. The clerk just looked at me, asked what unit I served with, and then once I confirmed, he'd walked into the back to make a phone call. When he re-emerged, he held a small, torn-off piece of paper in his hand, one with the following note written on it. "Walk into the woods off Laurel Fork after dark. No pictures." It was all the information he had for me, but it was all I needed. That night, once the sun had fully set, me and Tack walked out of the small Inez Motel where we were staying at, got into my car, and drove back down to Three Forks. The darkness gave the overgrown, rust-eaten place an ominous feel, and the closer we got to Laurel Fork, the more anxious I got. By the time we reached the dead end of Laurel Fork, and I switched on the old flashlight I kept in the glove box, I'm not afraid to admit I was downright scared. It was the first time that me and Tack had gotten anywhere in the dark in an unfamiliar area since Nam, but there was something else to do, something I could not quite put my finger on until the following night. Like I said, I was so nervous that Tack could sense it, and he stayed glued to my heel for most of the walk. Then, after a few minutes of trudging through the darkness, I began to hear something. something that sounded almost like singing. Moments later, I saw a dim light shining from beyond the trees, somewhere in the distance. I got a little closer, then realized what I was looking at. It was the shape of a large revival tent, set up in a small clearing, and the light was coming from the lantern of a dark, shadowy figure. Since I figured they were expecting me, I switched my flashlight back on, then slowly began to approach with Tack by my side. "Welcome, brother," the figure said. "I trust you've adhered to the terms of our agreement." "Yes, sir," I replied. "No cameras, just me and my dog." "Good," the stranger replied. "Now come meet Pastor Childers." As he lifted a tent flap, I was met with a surprising sight. I'd gotten into my head that these folks were some serpentine death cult, yet they seemed just like any other small-town congregation in America. A guy was plucking a guitar at the head of the congregation, while the worshippers sang a cheerful melody of, "When I hear that trumpet sound, I'm going to get up out the ground. Ain't no grave gonna hold my body down." Once the musical number ceased, the congregation applauded the banjo player before a very distinctive-looking man took the stage. He was pale and stick-thin, with a shock of curly red hair and a fiery mustache, wearing a white button-down and black slacks. As soon as he came into view, Tack's ears shot up, and he softly began to growl. "Brothers and sisters," the man began to bellow, "we welcome an esteemed guest in our humble house of worship tonight." The announcement prompted a handful of worshippers to shoot a welcoming smile at me. "He's come all the way down here to the holler tonight from New York City." He talked about the place like it could have just as easily been Mars. "But he isn't no federal man coming to take away your rights. He's come to show all those tyrants in Washington that what we are doing isn't harming anybody down here in God's house. Isn't that right, brothers and sisters?" The congregation erupted in whoops and cheers of approval, and in a way, he was right. If folks were dying because they were dancing with rattlesnakes, that was undeniably tragic. But no one was forcing them to, and they weren't exactly going out of their way to hurt anyone. So for me, it really did raise the question, do we live in a free country or not? The pastor continued with his sermon for a spell. Then, after ushering in another musical number, walked down the center row of seats to greet me. But as he got within arm's reach, Tack exploded in a flurry of furious barks. "Tack!" I growled at him. "Quiet, boy." But Tack just would not stop. He barked so loud and so intensely that some of the worshippers were turning to us with angry looks on their faces. "Brother, I really must insist you tie that thing up outside," Pastor Childers said, his cheerful demeanor slipping a little as he spoke. Normally, if someone spoke about Tack like that, I'd tell them to kick a rock. But this was work, so I made an exception. I took Tack outside and asked what the hell had gotten into him. Then, for the first time since the day we had both been wounded in combat, he alerted. There were no booby traps here, no Viet Cong to worry about, but he still told me danger was present. I was concerned, but I had not come too far just to turn back. I told him to stay and assured him I'd be back in a moment. Tack laid down, shooting me a frightened look, but did as he was told. "Must be that he can smell the snake on me," the pastor said when I re-entered the tent. At the time, that made all the sense in the world to me, and since he had given me a conversational window into asking him about snakes, I took the initiative. "My snakes rarely bite," he said, with a warm smile. "They sure got the devil in 'em. All serpents do, but Satan's power is weakest here in the Lord's house. However, on the occasion they do bite, it shall not hurt them. They shall lay hands on the sick, and they shall recover. That being said," he broke off, turning his neck to one side, revealing 2 dark pinprick scars upon his throat. To my knowledge, no one had ever been survived by being bitten on the neck by an eastern diamondback. Yet here stood this pastor, living, breathing proof that it was possible. Only, that wasn't quite his version of events. When I asked him how he survived, his response was cryptic to say the least. "That's just the thing, brother," he said. "I didn't." When I asked him what he meant by that, the pastor called out to one of his congregations. "Brother Robert," he yelled, "show our guest here how we are unafraid." I watched in disbelief.
as a boy no older than 20 fetched a wicker basket from one side of the stage before pulling out the biggest rattlesnake I'd ever laid eyes on. Then, in rhythm with singing and clapping of the congregation, he starts bouncing this thing up and down in his grip. I expected that the rattler would just wheel around and bite him in an instant, but to my amazement, it looked completely disinterested. My jaw is on the floor as I am trying to figure out if it's the music, the rhythmic bouncing, or if these snakes have been sedated before the service, and I only snap out of it when I hear the pastor speak again. "You see, brother," he hissed into my ear, "you see how we got the devil on a leash?" I must admit, I was impressed. Balls for picking up a rattlesnake like that, but it didn't seem the least bit interested in biting him. I had to drag myself out of that awestruck stupor to get the interview back on track. I finally asked him what he meant when he said he didn't survive the snake bite. He just looked at me and grinned, his lips squirming like the truth was on the tip of his tongue. But all that came out was a Bible verse. "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever lives by believing in me will never die." My first guess was that Pastor Childers hadn't died. More like he had miraculously survived a period of unfathomable pain and suffering, and lost a little of his sanity in the process. But Pastor Childers was telling the truth. Only before I could question him any further, one of the congregations let out an ear-piercing screech. Another worshiper rushed to take control of the rattler Brother Robert had been holding, while the boy himself held out his forearm, 2 tiny droplets of blood bubbling out before running down his alabaster skin. He had been bitten. "You excuse me, brother," Pastor Childers said, as pandemonium erupted. "But please, come back tomorrow night. If the boy doesn't survive, he'll be resurrected. Come see, come see." And at that, he was gone, sucked into the throng of hysterical worshippers as they flocked around the venom-stricken boy. I left disgusted at the waste of a young life, switching on my flashlight as I walked back into the darkness. "Come on, boy, let's get out of here." Tack jumped up, his tail wagging in relief before we trudged off through the trees. When I awoke the next morning, I had no intention of returning to the revival tent to watch Brother Robert's resurrection. I had seen enough medics hopelessly laboring over dead men to know that once you're gone, there's no bringing you back. Instead, I planned to check out the motel before the long drive back to Syracuse. Only as I was loading up my car, I heard a soft, mousy voice calling out from behind me. "Hey, mister." It was a young woman, maybe about 16 or even 17 years old. "You're headed down to the worship tonight, right?" I hadn't noticed her the night before, but evidently she had noticed me. No, I replied. "I don't know what they're going to do with that boy, but he passed," she interjected, a sadness in her eyes. "Last night, a few hours after you left, but they're going to bring him back tonight." She believed it too. You could hear it in her voice. "I'm sorry, but you can't bring people back." I felt like a major D-bag saying it to her, but it was the truth. At least I thought it was. "Your pastor is a liar. He wasn't resurrected. There's no such thing." "Sure there is, mister, and you're going to tell everyone about it." I slammed my trunk shut and turned to face her. "And why would you want me to tell everyone?" I asked. "That'll mean feds crawling all over these hills. They'll arrest your pastor and take his snakes. Because it needs to stop. All of it needs to stop." She was growing more increasingly agitated, and her voice cracked as she spoke. "What they're doing down there, it's wrong, sure. Most of the time, they come back okay. But every so often, they come back different, and they got to put 'em down. I don't want to see Robert like that. I just can't, but they're going to, and... Okay," I said, cutting her off before she descended into panic. "I'll head down to the tent again, tonight, and try to stop whatever they're going to do, okay?" "Thank you, mister. Thank you," the girl replied, her cheeks now slick with tears. Before I had a chance to say anything else, she was on her way. That night, me and Tack repeated the ritual of gearing up, getting in the car, and driving down to Three Forks. Only this time I had even less of an idea of what to expect. We had hit the dead end of Laurel Fork, and again walked through the drizzling rain towards where the tent had been the night before. Once again, they were expecting me,
but when I entered, I found the tone to be very different than the night before. Instead of singing, dancing, and clapping, the congregation was silent, and there was a distinct tension in the air. "Ah," Pastor Childers exclaimed as I walked in. "Welcome, brother. God told me you'd return, and here you are." Childers was standing over 2 white plastic camping tables, which held up Brother Robert's lifeless corpse, and it was quite evident that he was dead. He had that deathly pallor about him, that same grim jaundice I had seen so many others have in Vietnam. Behind him was the same man who had welcomed me into the tent the previous night, only this time he was carrying a shotgun. "Pastor, we need to talk." "Not now, brother. Plenty of time to talk when Brother Robert is back." "Brother Robert isn't coming back, Pastor. You and I—" "Please, no more talking," Pastor Childers interrupted. "All your doubts will be cleared soon enough. Now take your seats, brothers and sisters. The time of rebirth is upon us." Again, Tack was growling something fierce, but he kept it low, sticking close to my side as we were awaiting to what was to come. "We got something special here, folks," Childers began. "There's something in these hills that God put here long, long ago, and we must show our gratitude for it." A smattering of amens came back from the congregation before the pastor continued. "So, will it be with the resurrection of the dead?" he said, his voice rising with every sentence. "The body that is sown is perishable, but it's raised imperishable. It's sown into dishonor, but it was raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, but it is raised in power." The congregation were calling back to him now, as he motioned to a man off stage. "Bring me the serpent that took this boy's life." Pastor Childers bellowed, and at his command, the man picked up the same wicker basket that Brother Robert had carried just the night before. In it was the snake that killed him, still alive and still deadly. Childers whipped open the lid, plunged his hand into the basket, and raised the snake up by its head. And as he held it up to the congregation, he produced a small knife and began to slice through the snake's throat. Once it had been decapitated, another member of the congregation appeared to be holding a large glass bowl, and the snake's blood was carefully and methodically drained into it before they continued. Then Pastor Childers placed the snake's remains on Brother Thomas's lifeless chest before taking a short step back. "I declare to you, brothers and sisters," he bellowed, "that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable. We will not sleep. We will all be changed." The congregation began to whoop and holler, and in turn Pastor Childers' intensity began to build. In a flash, in a twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet, the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. He was foaming at the mouth now, fire and brimstone in his words. Then and only then we will have the saying that will come true: death has been swallowed up in victory. As Pastor Childers ranted and raved, my attention was suddenly drawn away from him. The headless snake that lay on Robert's chest, it began to move. It was only slight at first, little twitches that could easily be mistaken as belated death throes, but soon it was unmistakable. The dead snake was moving. "Where, O death, is your victory?" Childers screamed, motioning to the sheer impossibility before him. "Where, O death, is your sting?" And at that the snake began to slither, stumped first into Brother Robert's open mouth and down into his throat. I could not believe what I was seeing. Watching the headless, blood-soaked snake disappear down Brother Robert's throat was the single most horrifying thing I had ever witnessed. Nothing I had seen in Nam could possibly compare. But instead of running for their lives, the congregation were in raptures. Some were weeping, others spoke in tongues, the rest simply stood there, as in a deep trance, swaying from side to side. Me, on the other hand, it was like I was dumbstruck. I was glued to that spot, just clamoring to comprehend what the hell I was seeing. Then, when I thought things couldn't get any more insane, Brother Robert woke up. Tack was just about losing his mind at this point, unleashing a flurry of high-pitched whines as he tugged at the sleeve of my jacket. He was begging me to leave, but I just couldn't. I remember putting a hand on my mouth in pure shock, watching as Brother Robert coughed, sputtered, and gasped for air.
He looked terrified, his sunken eyes wide and fearful, and they darted around the room in confusion. The congregation spilled out of their seats toward him. People were weeping. Others cried out hallelujah. The joy they felt was otherworldly, and as Brother Robert embraced his loved ones after a long, deep sleep, he began to smile. All eyes were on Robert. Not a single person wanted this moment to be missed, this miracle of a resurrection. All except one. The girl who had visited me at the motel. She was staring at me, the desperate look in her eyes that screamed for God's sake to do something. But I didn't have anything to do, because Robert did it for me. "Give me some room," Pastor Childers cried out. "Let me welcome our dear brother back into the land of the living." The congregation rescinded like waves from a beach, allowing Childers to get face to face with the still smiling Robert. Only as I watched him approach, I noticed there was something horribly wrong about Robert's face. His eyes were wide open, almost like he didn't have any eyelids at all, and his smile was stretched so unnaturally wide that I swear you could see every single one of his teeth. It wasn't a happy smile. It was something else. Something terrifying. "Robert," Childers asked. "Robert, it's me, Pastor Childers. I want to..." Childers was silenced by the lightning-fast movement of Robert's arms. In an instant, his hands were wrapped around the pastor's throat. He gasped for air as the congregation leapt to his defense, trying to pry Robert's hands off of his neck. But it was no good. For a man who had been clinically deceased just a few moments before, Robert was horrifyingly strong, and we all heard the moment he crushed the pastor's larynx with a sickening crunch. Robert then swung the pastor around, knocking down several of the congregation as he flung the man's limp body in the direction. "Robert, no, what in the God's name are you doing?" Yet it was as if he could not hear them. He simply grabbed another member of the congregation and sunk his teeth into her face. The scream she let out was gut-wrenching, punctuated by the sound of a shotgun shell racking into the chamber. "Get the hell off of her, Robert!" The armed man roared, aiming the barrel squarely at his head. Robert let go, spitting out the chewed remains of her nose on the earthen floor of the tent, and with that same sick smile splitting his face into two, he slowly turned back towards the armed man. "Please, Robert," he said. "Please snap out of it." Robert responded by taking a few slow steps toward him, before suddenly and violently lunging. Buckshot tore through the right side of Robert's skull, popping it open like a smashed watermelon. The boy stood there for a moment, staggering to and fro, and then it looked like he was about to drop. Then out of nowhere, Robert once again lunged towards the man, grabbing hold of the shotgun and using it as leverage to smash what remained of his forehead into the man's mouth. He fell back, letting go of the shotgun, blood pouring from his pulverized lips. Robert had racked around into the shotgun, a percussive hit to the melody of the downed man's pleas for his life. Some of his teeth fell out of his mouth as he begged. Robert aimed the shotgun square at the man's hands, clasped together in a prayer, and fired. The man howled as everything above the wrist simply disintegrated, all while the congregation begged Robert to come to his senses. Instead, he racked another round into the chamber, aimed the shotgun at the wounded man's head, and fired. The sound of his scream degenerating into a gurgle still haunts my nightmares. And that was the moment I came to my own senses and got the hell out of that revival tent. "Run, boy, run!" I screamed, but Tack did not need to be told. He bolted on ahead as the sounds of the unfolding massacre echoed through the trees behind us, and here's where I bring up my wounded leg. Remember the one I told you about 12 pages back? It means I can't run very far or very fast, and we ended up paying for it, because at one point I looked back to see something catching up to us. I think it's another survivor from the tent, but when I turn, all I see is Brother Robert, hurling towards me, shotgun in hand. He pumps one final round into the chamber, raises the shotgun, and then something else tears past me in the darkness. It was Tack barreling towards the thing that used to be Brother Robert, and, with his good eye, it tracked Tack as he leapt towards him and took its last shot. The next thing I see is Brother Robert in the dirt, and Tack has him by the throat, whipping his neck back and forth, chewing and piercing, drowning Robert in his own blood. At first, I didn't think that'd finish him off, but when Tack climbed off of him and Robert ceased to move, I breathed a deep sigh of relief, but it was one taken far too soon. No sooner than I had said good boy, Tack collapsed to the ground. The thing that used to be Robert had indeed landed his final shot, filling Tack's gut full of buckshot in the seconds before he delivered the killer blow. I went into autopilot, picked Tack up and ran as fast as I could back to the car, driving like a man possessed, not even sure where I was headed. I just remember looking over at him at one point to see if he was still alive, if he was still with me, and he was gone. His big brown eyes stared off into oblivion. I pulled the car over to the side of the highway and burst into tears. I never loved anything in my whole life like I loved that dog. After we got back from Nam and the things had gotten bad for a while, he was the only thing that kept me from eating my gun. Every single time I thought about ending it, I think who's going to feed Tack? And that was that. All the guys whose lives he had saved, they'd kick my ass if they knew I'd ever dared to mistreat him. He was my best friend in the world, and now he was gone. I tried and failed to save his life, just like he had saved mine that day in the jungle, and just like he did that day in Three Forks. And that's just something I must live with. I couldn't bring myself to write up the story. I just apologized to my editor and told him I had to pass on it. After all, who in their right minds would believe me? When he asked about what happened in Kentucky, I just told him it was a hunting accident. A few years later, I took a job down in Florida, working as the sports correspondent for the Gainesville Sun, and I ended up retiring here too. I mean, to go back to Three Forks one day, to really address what happened. Just not yet, not yet. I have a new dog these days, also ex-military, and he's also a German Shepherd. I think he takes more care of me than I take care of him at this point, and he certainly makes for better company than my ex-wife. As for a name, I call him Junior, and I don't think I have to tell you who that's after.